People think that somehow Israel is coming back, you know. Somehow people got the idea that we're in, that we're in this, I don't know how you say it really. They kind of got this idea that Jesus came and he just kind of modified Judaism, you know. The Judaism still exists, but Christ just kind of came and kind of modified it in that the Jews and Christians are all kind of on the same path to heaven, you know. A lot of people believe that. I don't know if you believe that or not. I hope you don't, but a lot of people believe that. And, Hebrews is a book who really tells us that's not true, right? That's not true. We're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, right? And, we talked a little bit about this idea that, as we quit last week, about this idea that, Levi collected a tenth through Abraham because Levi was still in the body of his ancestor. And that's important because what that basically says is that this priestly order of Melchizedek that we're talking about, that it precedes Aaron, precedes that priestly line. We don't think much about priests before the law because the law is what instituted this Aaronic priesthood, right? So we really think, okay, so that starts with the law. But what you have to understand is that before the law, patriarchs basically took the role of priests. They offered sacrifice and they talked to God like Abraham did. So even though you had this Levitical law come in and this priesthood come into effect, what Melchizedek shows is that there was a priesthood before Levi, and because of that, it's superior, in other words, right? It's a predecessor to the Levitical lineage, right? If perfection could have been attained, listen to what he says, through the Levitical priesthood, and indeed the law given to the people established through that priesthood, then why was there still need for another priest to come, one in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aaron? For when the priesthood is changed, the law must be changed also. So the old law is done, changed, finished. It's not there anymore. When Jesus Christ died, that law ceased to exist. There's no salvation in the law. There never was salvation in the law, number one. It never existed. There was no such thing as salvation in the law of Moses. That didn't exist, right? Never existed. And now they come along, Christ comes along, they're like, well, now, this has changed. What is the problem with this idea? I know I'm kind of hung up on this, but it really bothers me. What's the problem with this theory, this idea that, Jesus is going to come again, we're going to have this Battle of Armageddon, this premillennialist idea? What's the basis of that idea, you see? Where does that come from? Well, number one, it didn't even come around until the last century. It didn't even really come along until in the 40s. What happened was that the book of Revelation for centuries, well, I ain't going to say for centuries, but the book of Revelation, especially after the Reformation, during the Reformation, the book of Revelation became, according to people like Calvin and Luther and all them guys, it was very much a picture of the Catholic Church. That was the idea of the book of Revelation. The Antichrist you read about in John, that was the Pope, you see. And the nation that was going to be defeated, that was Catholicism. It was very pointed. And the people wrote huge volumes of stuff. You can look it up. That basically took this whole book of Revelation and this whole prophecy of Revelation, and it pointed it against the Catholic Church, against Roman Catholicism. There was a monk that came along, and he decided more or less, well, this is Rex's cliff note of history. A monk came along and decided, enough's enough, right? Tired of him beating up on the Pope, tired of him beating up on Roman Catholicism. So he came up with this kind of end of the world theory. And there was a study Bible that came out, Schofield Bible came out, and in that study Bible, that theory was put forth in the notes of that study Bible, and it gained popularity. And eventually people come to this idea of this premillennialist. In other words, this 1,000-year reign out of Revelation 20, right? This 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. So, and I was taught over Revelation, and most of you have been through my class in Revelation. You know I don't agree with that whatsoever. But so this idea came into existence. But what you have to understand about the theory of premillennialism is it really goes back to Daniel. And Daniel's 70 weeks, you see. And in Daniel's 70 weeks, he puts forth the idea that there's going to be this end of the 70th week. It's going to be like the start of a new kingdom. Okay, this is a very big paraphrase. So what happened was, as we know, Daniel's 70 weeks starts with the issue, the decree to rebuild the temple. So we know 70 weeks, 490 years. So we go forward 6 weeks because that's where we see Christ coming. And Christ came at just about the right time, so everything's cool. And then Daniel says, in the middle of the last week, the sacrifice will cease. Well, Jesus died about 3.5 years, so essentially the sacrifice ceased at 3.5 years. And then at the end of the other 3.5 years, you're going to have this kingdom. Well, what premillennialists do is they split that last week. They say, okay, so everybody kind of agrees with the idea that the 3.5 years, the middle of the last week is Christ. Almost everybody agrees with that. But then what happens is the people who are premillennialists say, well, basically this is the premise. Christ came, he was supposed to start a kingdom. Didn't get it done. Jews rejected him. So he put a stopgap in place. The church should have never went to the cross. That wasn't why he came. You see, that's what they don't tell you about this theory. None of that should have ever happened. He should have set up this earthly kingdom, should have reigned from Jerusalem, everything would have been good. But that didn't happen because the Jews rejected him, he didn't become a king. So basically what they do is they said, okay, so at that 3.5 where Jesus died, we still have 3.5 years left. We got another half of a week, right? And so they're saying, so basically the church came and then time stopped. So we got this huge gap of time, and then you're going to start this other 3.5 weeks. Now let me explain to you briefly what the problem with that is. According to Daniel's prophecy, the sacrifice has to stop in order for the 3.5 weeks to begin. Okay? Well, there's a problem with that, isn't there? Because there's no sacrifice, because there's no temple, right? So if you listen to Bot Radio, Dr. Jeremiah and all those guys, and you listen to all these that promote premillennialism, and you're into that, you listen to those stations, you keep hearing this, the temple's going to be rebuilt, right? Anybody ever listen to that? Temple's going to be rebuilt. I was listening the other day. He says, we got a warehouse, and we're already building the articles of the temple. Send your money. We're building the articles of the temple. So when the temple's rebuilt, we're going to put all that back in there. We're going to rebuild the temple on the Temple Mount, and we're going to start the sacrifice. Then we're going to end the sacrifice. And then Christ is going to come because we got to have a sacrifice to end, you see. Premillennialists don't explain all this really well. Most people that are premillennialists probably don't really even understand the whole principle of it. But so now that this is going on in the Middle East, you see, and you got Israel fighting Gaza and all this going on, right? All this stuff going on. See, every time something like this happens, that's what you start hearing on the radio. These guys, oh, this is the time. This is the time. They're going to destroy Islam. They're going to tear down they're going to tear down the temple of the mosque. They're going to build the Jews are going to build a temple, and we're going to start the sacrifice. You see? Now, I don't know what y'all think about this, but that just sounds like a whole lot of hogwash to me, you know? But that's kind of the premise of this. And that's without getting really deep into Daniel's weeks, but that's the idea of it. So their idea now is that, okay, since Israel the temple has to be rebuilt and the sacrifice has to start, we need to support Israel. So now you hear all this, Christians for Israel, right? Christians for Jews, right? Save Israel. Send your money, right? Save Israel, because we have to preserve Israel, because if we don't preserve Israel, We can't start a sacrifice again. We can't build a temple. We can't do all these things. You have to have Israel. So because of that, they say, okay, so now we're just kind of parallel with each other. In other words, Judaism's still okay, because guess what? We haven't ended that week. So Judaism's still good, Israel's still good, and Christianity's still good, and we're just kind of running together until this all changes, and we go to that last week, and then Jesus is going to come, and then boom, we're all going to be together. We're going to have a big battle of Armageddon. Jesus is going to rule for Jerusalem for 1,000 years, and it's going to be the end. Does that kind of make sense? Well, what does Hebrews say about this? It says no, right? No, it's not going to happen. The law changed, right? Jesus himself said, right? Jesus himself said, you got to be grafted into the new vine, right? In other words, you can't exist, you see. So this is kind of where we run into this big kind of deal, right, of what's going on here. But I hope that maybe that kind of explains to you, if you hear some of this, you hear people talking about this, that's kind of the basis of reasoning that goes along with that. But in Hebrews, he says, listen, the law has to change, right? The law's got to change. You've got to change the law. You can't exist under this same law. It has to change, right? So it's interesting in 12, law's not capitalized there, right? Because he's saying you're getting ready. He's not necessarily limited to the law of Moses. He's saying there's going to be the law of Moses, but a new law is going to take over that. In other words, you're going to change the law, right? He whom these things belonged to a different tribe, and no one from that tribe had ever served at the altar. He was from Judah, right? Nobody from Judah had ever served at the altar. That had always been the tribe of Levi. For it is clear the Lord descended from Judah, and in regard to that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. And what we have said even more clear, if another priest like Melchizedek appears. What we have said is even more clear if another priest like Melchizedek appears. So how do we compare Christ to Melchizedek, right? How do we do that? So he's going to explain that. One who has become a priest not on the basis of regulation as to ancestry, but on the basis of an indestructible life. For it is declared, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. The former regulation is set aside because it is weak and useless. You see? So in other words, when Christ came, that law, all that Judaism, we had to set that aside. Because why? Because it was useless. It was weak. It was always weak. It was always useless. It was never good. It never worked. It never would work. It's not going to work because there was no salvation under the law. So we can't hold on to both things. We can't do that. And people so try to do that today. They so try to say, oh, Israel's going, Christians are going, we're just all together, we're in this parallel path, and we're all going to get to heaven. No. And when we preach that, when we teach that, when we say that, we're really going against what God has to say about things, you know? God doesn't say that. God says there's one way to heaven. Am I right? What does it say in Acts? There's one name under heaven which must be saved. Jesus Christ. Right? Moses can't save you. Right? Can't do it. You know? Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me. There's no other way. And that's a very exclusive text in the Greek. I am the only way, the only truth, the only life is what that means. There is not another. There's not another path. So, you know, I think when people say that, it really gets under my skin when I hear it. And I've heard that like 4 times in the last week. And it really gets under my skin, you know. I'm like, why do you listen to that? Why do you put up, you know, I used to think, oh, that's harmless, you know. I used to think, that's just harmless. You know, who cares? If people think Israel's going to heaven, I don't care, you know. And that's kind of was my attitude about it. I was in Washington, D.C. one time, several years ago. I was in Washington, D.C. And there was a little lady in this convenience store. And she's trying to get this case of water. And it weighed as much as she did, because literally this woman is like 3'8". And so she's trying to get this case of water. So I grabbed this case of water, and on her lapel is this deal. It says from like Garland, Texas somewhere, and it said Christians for Israel. And I says, what are you doing in Washington, D.C.? And she says, well, says, I'm retired, and I came up here because I'm trying to, help lobby Congress to support Israel because, we got to save Israel. And I thought, this isn't harmless, right? I mean, if we're taking resources that could be used for something, a woman who would move there to do that, I'm thinking, if she would move someplace and work as a missionary or something for something that mattered, it does matter, right? I mean, that's, she's taken away from what could be good by serving something that's false. And then the other thing I got to tell you is that since my mother's had this thing, I get her mail, literally. And it's like this much every day. It's all people wanting money. And, I filled up a trash can with this stuff. And half of those things is Jews for Israel, Jews for Israel, Jews for Israel. Or, Christians for Jews, Christians for Israel. It's not harmless. Because if you take all those resources people are putting into trying to keep Israel as a nation and use them towards something that was really valuable, like trying to feed people or spread the gospel or do something that was important, then that would be a lot better deal. It's not harmless. False teaching is never harmless. I used to kind of think that. I used to kind of think, well, you think your thing, I'll think my thing. But false teaching is never harmless. There's always a cost involved in it. So, anyway, I'll try to get off of that. But I really think we're in the middle of Hebrews. And Hebrews, he just really puts this down for us. He says, listen, he says, you're a priest forever. In other words, that priesthood's never going to end. For the law made nothing perfect. Why not? Huh? Can't take away sin. All the law can do is condemn you. The law can never save you. The law can never make you perfect. Possible. Can't do it. If you keep it to the letter of the law, to dotting every I and crossing every T, it can't save you. Can't do it. But it says a better hope's introduced, which we draw near to God. It was not out of oath. Others became priests without any oath, and he became priest with an oath when God said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. Because of those, Jesus became a guarantor of a better covenant. What's a guarantor? Shannon, you're a lawyer. What's a guarantor? So, if you get somebody to do that, you'd want somebody that could actually pay it, right? Keith wouldn't let somebody be a guarantor if they couldn't pay it, right? You'd want them to have some means. So they're just saying that he's a guarantor of it, right? He's a guarantor of a better covenant. So he purchased it, right? He bought it. He guarantees it. There have been many of those priests since death prevented from continuing in office. But because Jesus lives forever, he has become a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he's able to save completely those who come to God through him because he's always lives to intercede. Such a high priest truly meets our needs. And who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. So go back to the start of that, right? He says, because Jesus lives forever, he is a permanent priesthood. So if Jesus is a permanent priesthood, permanent high priest, is there any need for an earthly priest? Doesn't exist, right? How could you even figure that out? I guess maybe some Jew somewhere has kept track of this, but who would even be the high priest today? I don't even know if anybody even knows that. You know what I'm saying? Because it has to be of the lineage of Aaron. It has to be through the eldest son's lineage of Aaron, right? To be a true high priest. I don't even know if you could figure that out. I don't know that you could. Jerusalem was destroyed in 71 AD. We're 2,000 years away from that. I don't know. Who knows? Yeah. Yeah, I think the Holocaust did a lot to destroy that. You're right. You know, I'm sure there's still lineages exist because it's important to them, but like you say, a lot of that got disrupted. But then again, it was World War II why we established the nation of Israel, and then that's kind of what got all this going, right? I mean, that all kind of happened in the 40s, right? So Israel started in what, 48, right? Israel became a nation in 48, I think that's right. And, you know, basically this theology kind of started in the 40s. So it all kind of started together. You know, this whole thing kind of started together. Jesus doesn't have to make sacrifices every day, right? Because he was a perfect sacrifice. But Jesus is a perfect high priest. He is perfect forever. Over and over he tells us this. He's perfect forever. 2 Samuel 7 says, one's going to come from my loins, right? From my lineage, sit on that throne and establish a kingdom forever. That was Jesus. So there's no other need for a high priest. A parallel is established between Melchizedek and Christ. Christ is shown because of the oath of God to be, this is my summary, to be our perfect high priest and king, establishing new and better covenant between God and mankind. Christ has a permanent priesthood and can always intercede in our behalf in the very throne room of God. You know, right? That's what a high priest does. High priest intercedes. High priest is the only one under Judaism, under the law. A high priest is the only one that can go into the presence of God himself, technically. He's the only one that could do that. So Jesus, according to the scripture, is in the presence of the throne room of God himself, right? And because of that, he can always intercede for you and I. He knows our weaknesses. He knows who we are. So he becomes a perfect priest for us, a perfect high priest for us that's made a sacrifice once in his death on the cross, and no more sacrifice ever has to be made. He ended the sacrifice when he died on the cross. I think that's where people miss that in Daniel. They're like, well, the sacrifice didn't end because, you know, the temple stayed in existence till 71 AD. Christ died in about 30. But what you got to understand is when Christ died on that cross, the sacrifice of the temple became meaningless. It ended. There's no sense doing it. It was just wasting useless blood on an altar. It made no difference. We have a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, right? And who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle. Now this is where he's going to make this parallel between the earthly tabernacle and the heavenly tabernacle. Now, when you think about this with me, think for a minute. So, Moses comes down off the law, and God says, okay, this is what I want you to do. I want you to build this tabernacle in the wilderness, right? And I want it to be so big, exactly, right? God was very exact about it, right? Have you ever read that? He was very exact. I want it to be exactly this big. I want it to have exactly these things in it, right? And I want it to look just like this. And it's going to have this outer court where the priests are going to do their thing, and it's going to have this inner court, this holy place, and it's going to have this holy of holies where God dwells. Now let me ask you a question. Do you think God just randomly came up with that idea? Or do you think maybe he was trying to duplicate something on a small scale that already existed on a much larger scale? There you go. So it wasn't random, right? So basically, God said, let me give you this miniature version of heaven. Right? This parallel. Right. So sometimes when we read this, we think, well, you know, we had this tabernacle and then God makes heaven look like that. But let's think for a minute, maybe heaven looks like the tabernacle. Right? Because we know there's an altar in heaven, right? The souls cry out from under the altar, how long, how long? We know God dwells in heaven, right? We know there's separations of things in heaven, according to Revelation. So, if that's the truth, then he was giving us a picture of what it looks like in heaven. So now, if you take that picture and you transpose it, which is what he's doing here, then you get this idea kind of what's going on, right? There are already priests who offer gifts prescribed in law. They serve as sanctuaries, a copy and shadow of what is in heaven, right? It's a copy of it, shadow of what's in heaven. It said, this is why Moses also warned when he was about to build the tabernacle, see that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. It's very specific, right? He was very specific about exactly how to make it, how big to make it, what to make it out of, who was to make it. Everything was very specific. Every article in there was specific. What he was supposed to have, the altar of incense, right? The altar to make sacrifice on, the table of shewbread, inside, right? You had the Ark of the Covenant. So he was very specific about it, right? It says it's superior to the one. The new covenant is established on better promises. For if there had been nothing wrong with the first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. Better promises. What was the promise of the law? What was the promise that the law was Moses? What was that promise of the Israelites? What was that promise based on? What was the promise to the Israelites? Land and multitudes. Am I right? So that was the promise. That's all that law ever was about. Law was never about heaven, never about salvation, never about any of that. What's our promise? Heaven. Glad somebody said that. Right? Our promise is eternal life. For if there had been nothing wrong with the first, right, there wouldn't have been a place for another. But God found fault with the people, so the days are coming when I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It shall not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them, declares the Lord. That's pretty straight up, right? God said, you're my people, I'm going to be your God, but they turned away from the covenant. They broke the covenant, and so God said, I'm done with you. And I turned away from them, he says, right? So he did away with them whatsoever. This is the covenant established in the house of Israel. After that time, I'll put my laws in their minds. This comes out of Jeremiah. Write them on their hearts. I'll be their God. They'll be my people. What do you think that means? Put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. That's kind of a hard thought. How is that different than the law, you think? How does he put laws in our minds and write them on our hearts? No longer will they teach their neighbors, say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me. What do you think about that? I think it's a tough passage, you know, because even today they don't all know God, all know Christ. So I think it's a tough passage. Comes out of Jeremiah, and well, yeah, those of us do. But I think what God was saying is that the law was external. You know, in other words, the law wasn't, and Jesus criticized them over and over for that. The law was external. It shouldn't have been, but it was. It was all about what you did, how you looked, what you did, who you touched, when you washed, when you whatever. It's all about the external, right? And he says, but we're supposed to be internal, you know. It should be inside of us, you know. We don't worry about the regulation of the external as much as we do the motivation internally, is what Jesus would say. We should have the right motivation. I sometimes wondered what a motivation was a Jew really was. You know, what was their motivation? I don't really know sometimes what their real motivation was. I know my motivation. My motivation's to get to heaven. My motivation's to know Jesus. My motivation is to have eternity. I don't know the Jews really had the same motivation that we have. I don't know. I don't think so. You know, I guess maybe I shouldn't say that, but there's a lot of things that point to the idea that even today in Judaism, that they really didn't have the view of eternity that you and I have, and still don't, for the most part. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're definitely passionate in what they do. I agree with you for the most part. I mean, I think just like any other group, some of them are, some of them ain't. But yeah, Some of them are definitely passionate in what they believe, but overall their motivation, you know, I think a Jew's motivation would be to reestablish the priesthood, reestablish the temple. If I was a Jew, that would be my motivation because that's what their life revolved around was the temple. Without a temple, there's really no nation without a temple. Even though Israel's Israel, Israel was a theocracy. Israel revolved around the temple. And without that, it's really not Israel. It just isn't. It's got to be a thorn in their side every time they look up there and see that Islam mosque, right? They got to be thinking, when are we going to tear that down, right? It's got to be bad. It is bad. You know it's bad. You know what goes on over there. Yeah. Well, there's some indication. Abraham said, to die and be gathered to my people. Solomon said there's no planning or knowledge in Sheol where you were going, the idea of going to the realm of the dead. So they did believe in that realm of, most of them, I think, believed in that realm of the dead, that place where you go. But I think it's their idea that's a little different than our idea of that. So it's kind of holding place for the soul. Whether or not they believe in eternity, some of them do, I think. A lot of them don't. A lot of them still don't today. The majority of Jews today don't believe, like we believe, in a heaven or an eternity, but some do. But they certainly didn't have the same view of eternity or heaven that you and I have of heaven and eternity. I think that would be realistic to say that. Our view is definitely different than theirs, the way we view it. Yeah, we're going to get into that in Hebrews 11, that very idea. So that idea of rolling forward and forgiveness was in Christ. And he's getting to that. Because these Jews that he's talking to, he wants them to understand, well, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but he wants them to understand that they're going to go to heaven because of us, not because of them. Apart from us, they would not be made perfect, he says at the end of Hebrews 11. So he wants them to understand that they're going to heaven because of us, because of Christ, not because of the law, not because of Judaism. So, see, when he made it new, he made the first one obsolete, and it's obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. Now, it hasn't, but we know what he means. In other words, it's no longer valid. That old covenant is not valid any longer, right? It's been replaced by a new covenant, right? And the old one is going to disappear. And that's what we have to keep in mind as we get into this, is that we're not running the same path. There's only one path, And I think that's something we need to know. We need to be firm in that. There's only one way to heaven, period, and that's Christ. There's just not another way. And that's something we have to, I think we really need to know. It's something we need to preach and teach. People need to understand that. The world today thinks there's a lot of ways to heaven, not just Judaism, but they think there's a lot of people think, well, there's a lot of ways to the afterlife or to whatever, nirvana, I guess, if you're a Buddhist or Hindu or whatever, there's a lot of ways to this afterlife, but the Bible especially tells us that there's only one way, and that's Jesus Christ. And it's really something that we need to be firm in our conviction about that with people. Once again, we're still making this comparison, right? The earthly tabernacle had regulations. It was an earthly sanctuary set up in the first room with the lampstand, the table, its consecrated bread, was called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a room called the most holy place, which had the golden altar of incense, the gold-covered ark of the covenant, which contained the gold jar for manna, Aaron's staff that budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. I think it's interesting. We don't really get this in Hebrews, so it's kind of interesting. Wonder how heavy them stone tablets are. Do you ever think about that? They had to carry that ark. Can you make that on like 1 inch thick stone, God, instead of like 4 inch thick? I mean, then when he comes down, he's kind of grunting, you know, on 10 Commandments. He's kind of like, grunting. I'm thinking, maybe make them a little bit lighter, right? I don't know. But he says, so that's what we know is in there, right? There were cherubim of glory overshadowing the atonement cover, for we could not discuss those things in detail now, although more or less he does. When everything had been arranged like this, the priests entered regularly into the outer room to carry out their ministry. They did that all the time, right? That outer room, the holy place, that's where they did their stuff all the time. But only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year, and never without blood. He offered himself and for the sins of the people he committed in ignorance. Oh, once again we get into that, right? Wasn't for defiant sin. Sacrifice was not for defiant sin. It's just for sins committed in ignorance. Always a distinction there. And, you know, when they would move that ark, they would cover that in 3 layers of stuff before the guys would ever move it. Even the people that moved it, it had to be covered multiple times before they would ever even move it out of the Holy of Holies. It was very specific about how that ark had to be moved, how it had to be handled, how it had to be covered. Only certain people were allowed to do that. There was only one tribe, one group of Levites that was responsible for the Holy of Holies stuff. There's one that was responsible for the outer poles and tents, one responsible for the inner stuff. There were 4 groups of Levites, all responsible for different things. But the group that carried the Holy of Holies stuff, there's an interesting passage in the Old Testament. I know we're out of time. There's an interesting passage in the Old Testament if you get a chance. I can't tell you exactly where it is. I have to look it up. But it's where somebody donated oxen to the Levites, and they divided the oxen up. But the tribe that carried the Holy of Holies thing, they didn't get any oxen, because everything in that Holy of Holies had to be carried by the priests. Nothing could be put on an ox or a cart or anything else. Everything in that Holy of Holies had to be carried on the backs of the priests. And it's kind of an interesting passage, and it kind of sheds a little light on Uriah getting struck dead, because it just wasn't allowed. You know, you could not put that ark on a cart. You could not carry it. You had to carry that thing. They had to carry it with poles to the sides. They had to carry it to the back, as long with everything else that was in the Holy of Holies. All that had to be carried on the backs of the priests. A lot of stuff here. But yeah, if you get it, I'll try to look that up for you next week. But it's kind of an interesting passage that kind of gives you that idea. So everybody else got oxen, but not these guys. Everything they did, they carried on their backs. Thanks for your time this evening.